You're with The Hub. We're crossing live now to Brussels because Catherine Ashton, the EU's foreign policy chief, is holding a news conference. There we are. There's Miss Ashton talking about that decision by European Union foreign ministers to approve some of the toughest sanctions yet against Iran. The idea being that if they tighten the screw, so to speak, if you will, they will then get Iran to jettison, I guess that is the kindest way of saying it, to get rid of their aspirations to have a fully fledged nuclear program. We'll stay with that for a bit. We'll monitor what Catherine Ashton is saying there for you. In fact, I think we are actually going to just cross over there to Brussels and see what she's saying.
Through as many channels as I possibly can, including a letter to Dr. Jalili, the chief negotiator, on the 21st of October, in my conversations with Dr. Salehi, the foreign minister of Iran, and through many other interlocutors who have dialogue with Iran. We want to see them come back and either pick up the proposals that we put on the table in Istanbul a year ago and look at those as potential confidence-building measures, or to come with ideas of their own. And I send that message, if I may, through all of you, that that is the position today. I hope that Iran will respond positively to the letter that I sent, that it will respond positively to the messages that we have sent, and come back to the negotiating table. Not surprisingly, we are extremely concerned about the situation in Syria. I spoke with Secretary-General Nabil al-Arabi this morning before the Foreign Affairs Council in Cairo.
The foreign policy chief for the EU in Brussels, talking about using various conduits, trying to get the Iranian government back to the negotiating table. Let's speak now to Robin Mills, an expert in oil trading from the consulting firm Manar Energy. He's live for us in Dubai this hour. Robin, welcome to The Hub. What impact will these sanctions have?
Well, the aim of it, of course, is to prevent EU nations from buying Iranian oil with this deadline of July the 1st, by which all Iranian imports into the EU should have been suspended or ended. And the aim is, I think, is a bit of a complicated one, but part of the aim is to encourage the Iranians, or to force them, in fact, to seek out alternative customers. Most likely that would be China and perhaps India and some other countries as well. And so to constrict the circle of buyers for Iranian oil and to force Iran to offer discounts on its oil in order to find those buyers.
OK, but if the Saudis step into the gap, because they're on record now saying that's what they plan to do, in terms of the sanctions, what's the point? And also, what would that do to the price and to supply levels?
Yeah, so the big question is will this just be a reshuffling of Iranian exports? Instead of going to the EU, will more exports go to China and India and so on? Or will there be an actual reduction in Iranian exports? Now, the Saudis, as you say, have said they will make up for any shortfall in Iranian exports as a result of sanctions. In principle, Saudi Arabia has enough spare capacity to pretty much make up for most, if not all, of Iranian exports. But the issue then would be that Saudi Arabia would have to use up all of its spare capacity, which is essentially the only spare capacity there is in the world today. And then if you have a disruption as we had last year in Libya or perhaps in Nigeria or somewhere else, there's no spare capacity to make it up. So even if the amount of oil on the market remains the same with the Saudis stepping in, inevitably that will drive up prices because the market will be very concerned that there isn't any spare capacity to cover for any unexpected disruptions elsewhere.
How long until we end up paying for that at the petrol pump? Because I might be wrong here, but it always feels as if when there are prices to be passed on or a price hike to be passed on, it's passed on pretty quickly.
Prices were up a little bit today, a little bit over 1% in response to this latest move by the EU. Of course, the market will have to see how much the sanctions are really biting and what happens to Iranian exports, whether they're really being crimped by this before you see more of a price response. But yeah, I think the key thing is this going to be a reshuffling of supplies or an actual reduction, and that will determine the effect on prices.
We've already mentioned Asia, but just take us through, Robin, what could happen to the European countries here, because those EU countries, they are customers of Iran, but they are some of the weakest customers.
Well, they are, and some of the weaker European economies had asked for more time before these sanctions were imposed so they could sort out alternative suppliers. And in particular Greece, and Greece was relying a lot on Iranian oil because of the pretty easy credit terms that the Iranians were offering. And of course, Greece right now is its economic crisis. It's very useful for it if it can get those easy credit terms. So the Greeks in particular were pushing for a later start to sanctions.
Okay.
Now, they have got some time now, up until July, to arrange alternative supplies. And the Saudis, as you have said, could probably be the main ones stepping in there. It's not exactly a one-for-one replacement. The spare Saudi oil tends to be heavier than the Iranian oil, and lower quality, harder to refine. So it'll be a little bit difficult to find a one-for-one replacement. And that I think, could put some pressure on Greece in particular, and to a lesser extent perhaps on Italy and Spain.
Once these sanctions are in place, what are the chances that they step back from them?
This is the thing with sanctions, of course. It's always very difficult to step back from them. And of course, the US imposed oil sanctions on Iran right after the revolution 30 years ago, and those sanctions are still in place. So the experience is that it's easier to impose sanctions than to remove them. Now, we'll have to see what impact this has on prices. But of course, the EU, having imposed sanctions, would be reluctant to make a concession unless there's some move on the part of the Iranians as well. To get back to the point I made about if there's another disruption elsewhere, so if the Saudi spare capacity is fully committed and then there's a disruption somewhere else in the world, I think the EU and the US as well are in a bit of a difficult position, because then Iran would have been made into the holder of spare capacity, the only holder of spare capacity in the world. And then you'd have a very difficult situation. You have to say, maybe if prices are rising because of a crisis elsewhere, do you then relax sanctions on Iran in order to let that oil back in the market, even if at the cost of damaging the policy you were trying to enforce against Iran? So it really does create a very tricky situation. And of course, the Iranians do have some ways of responding. And I particularly point to Iraq as one place where Iran might be able to respond in order to upset suppliers in another place.
Robin Mills, many thanks for joining us here on The Hub from Dubai. Turkey has threatened